This forum has been organised by the Intervention Rollback Action Group in Hardware, Alice Springs, and Stop the Intervention Collective Sydney. Both groups have websites where you can make contact. Tonight, our forum carries the title, The Intervention, Will It End? After 15 years of the implementation of these draconian and racist laws, we have the opportunity to hear from First Nations people living under the laws. We collectively must demand that no such laws ever exist in the future. We thank Thalia Anthony, long-term activist against the intervention and Professor of Law at UTS, for stepping in at the last minute, and I mean literally, 5 minutes ago, stepping in to be our moderator at this forum. We're very grateful for everyone participating. So thank you, and over to you, Thalia.
Thank you, Kathy, and it's an absolute honour to be moderating tonight's forum with amazing speakers who I've followed over 15 years in their resistance and fight against the intervention. I'm also on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise this always has been and always will be Gadigal land. I would like to begin by just saying a few words about this pivotal time. We're approaching June, when the sunset clause sets in to end, in words, in policy, in legislation, the intervention. And yet we can see today that many of the practices of the intervention are as fierce and as damaging as ever. We can see the racism in the policies, in the practices of governments, both federal and Northern Territory governments. We can see the fatal acts of police officers in community. We can see how children are being ripped apart from Aboriginal families. And so to talk about the end of the intervention, I think really is about talking about words. What we need to do, as Sticks have been doing for over a decade, is continue to fight against this oppressive state and oppressive culture that ensures that Aboriginal people and land continue to be colonised. And I think that tonight we're going to hear about not only the injustices, but the strength of the struggles. And I really look forward to it. And like I said, it's an absolute privilege to be here. I'd like to begin by introducing Ani Elaine Kunware Peckham, who's an American Artea woman of Mpate, a senior Central Aranda custodian. Ani Elaine has been involved in this movement for well over a decade. She's a proud mother and grandmother, and she has fought for the rights of her people to be respected, including in groups such as Grandmothers Against Removal. She was born and raised on her country, and she is grateful that her parents taught her about country. It's because that she has been exposed to two-way learning that she knows the possibilities of keeping strong, of speaking strong, and continuing to assert the laws of the land and of the people in Central Australia. With her, we have Kumanjay Banbaji Hodawa Watt, a Ladle man from Gunua, Mornington Island, and he has lived and worked in Central Australia and the Gulf of Carpentaria for the last 35 years. He's focused on First Nations media for over 20 years with Karma, Central Land Council, and he writes for NITV Online, Koori Mail, Indigenous X, and The Guardian. Welcome to both of you.
All right, I'll go. What are the greetings? Thanks for having us I've sort of jumped in last minute too. But yeah, I suppose I've got to acknowledge the Arundel Murra lands we're on, peoples, First Nations of Central Australia and the NT and across the country as well. So I guess I probably didn't know as much about the fracking stuff, which relates to the ongoing injustices involved with the intervention. Just listening to Thalia now talk about the ongoing colonialism. In a way, it's tried to be a bit more not subtle about it, but not as in your face as it was in the past, with pointing rifles in our faces, except for, say, Yuendamu and with deaths in custody. So yeah, I guess in a way, a bit more cultural colonialism and genocide, using the policies, you know, through the policies that are saturated in that racism, that are pretty obvious, but people seem to go along with. I know we saw with the start of the intervention, it pretty much gave people more license to be outright blatantly racist on the street, talk down to Aboriginal people, countrymen, see it at supermarkets. Well, I mean, they literally at the supermarkets had a separate line for Aboriginal people using the welfare quarantining card, basics card, racist card. So I guess, yeah, I guess seeing that, I was still at CAMA, the Central Australian Aboriginal Media Association radio news team, when when the intervention came in. So yeah, we went down to cover it in 2008, and for the convergence on Canberra, the national convergence, and the apology, a national apology to the stolen generations, just happened to coincide with that. I think, was it the second day? Anyway,
The day after.
yeah. So, you know, we're sort of there watching this apology happen for the past wrongs committed and atrocities committed against Aboriginal peoples, families and communities and individuals. And while they're still continuing to do exactly the same things, just in sort of roundabout ways, maybe some not so direct, and then some, yeah, pretty blatantly targeting Aboriginal people. So yeah, I guess having been up in Darwin the other week, I was invited by Get Up to go to the Senate fracking, the fracking Senate inquiry, fracking in the NT. And so I wrote a piece for Indigenous X last week, and we had a briefing on the first day, the day before the public hearings. And I know that that you know, the elephant in the room that kept coming up was the intervention and how that was precursor for a lot of that stuff. You had Gadreen Hoosen, Bubba, cousin brother from Borroloola, long-time campaigner, especially against, you know, against the MacArthur River mine. They had a 5.5 kilometre expansion of destruction of the river to expand the mine there to open cut, destroyed a men's site that we accessed as well, from Woonona, Mornington Island. And so, you know, that was signed off by Peter Garrett when he was Environment Minister. So yeah, we get to see that it doesn't matter whether it's Liberal or Labor. They seem to keep supporting these sorts of racist regimes designed to keep us down and push us down further, and probably access our lands. And Gadreen, sorry, going back to Gadreen, he did raise the intervention. I'll just get a quote. So, Garawa man, Gadrian Husum, pointed to the never-ending anti-intervention that was seen by some when it began in 2007 as a Canberra-led siege against Aboriginal land rights intended to insidiously breach and weaken the independence of First Nations autonomy. Quote, the anti-intervention, this is what it's about, or this what it's about. Baba brother Gadrian has had enough of the broken promises from mining companies and the politicians that back them. Quote, we put a stop on them. We keep saying no to them. If we all pull together, we can beat them. Tell them to get out of our land and go away. That's the only way. You rip the story off the land, you can't replace that. Yeah, so I guess that really emphasizes how not much has really changed as far as the continuation of those racist policies. And, you know, maybe I'd speak to how we actually get to have some of that change, but maybe we'll go to that a bit after. Do you want to add on? No?
Like Steve was saying, it's when is it going to end? This very racist intervention and how it's been implemented to us, but to us it's just like it's a non-ending story, but to us it's embedded in us, and it's how we feel about it at the moment, and our hurt, the pain we've been through, and how we are surviving this. We've survived so long, but how can we survive this if it will never, if the intervention will never end? That's my feeling that I spoke up last night after Get Up. It said we'll never give up hope. But just think of our young ones that are coming through today, the grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. We'd like to see something there that they can live for. At the moment, I find it hard to see that happening, because since we were taken out of when our rights were taken away through the
Oh yeah,
the Racial Discrimination Act, and from there we never seem to get anywhere in trying to bring that back for us. I believe now I'm still hurting. Yeah, it's hard to really talk about it, but the only way we can do it is still talk about it, speak about it. We are breathing it, we are walking it. And just imagine our grandchildren and our children are seeing it, but how can we give them that strength to keep speaking up about the intervention? I think you have to really, to go through something like that, you have to go through that to know what it's like. What's the intervention? You're breathing the intervention and it's still there. That is why I'm finding it hard to, at the moment, but the day it came into power, the intervention, I really mean power. You tried to take away our powers, our cultural heritage, our cultural values and obligation to our people and to the land. But now that is why we speak so big about the fracking, and also the muggeries up in Tanner Creek that happened on their land. You know, look how long it took the Muggary women to really walk and breathe and smile again. 8 years. 8 years it took them to get their rights back. And yeah, we just need to keep going there because we know we've got a lot of support. And if you didn't have the supports of others like yourself, yeah, I don't know where we'd be today, dear. Even last night, and talking to the politician, couldn't even see anything, no change in them. You know, they just sit there and think that, oh, everything's all right. You're still here. But, yeah, dear.
It's hard to talk about. Hey, it's a lot of trauma over 15 years. And I think the young kids who've grown up under the intervention, the only salvation has been seeing the fight in response and holding on to culture despite all the harms thrown at community. I think
what they call the mob at Mount Nancy, kids of the intervention.
Yeah, and like you were saying, Kumanjay, it was you know, when they had the intervention, there were unprecedented exploration licenses for mining, and so there's a direct correlation there. It's not a coincidence. It, you know, the whole purpose was to remove the rights of Aboriginal people to land and to sovereignty. And like you said, Auntie Elaine, they had at the beginning the Racial Discrimination Act suspended. They recognized, the government recognized it was a direct breach of the Discrimination Act, and the United Nations called it out. And then when we had the Stronger Futures Act, they reinstated the Racial Discrimination Act, but nothing changed. And this is what we're probably going to see now. They'll get rid of Stronger Futures in the Northern Territory. They'll get rid of the intervention language, but nothing looks like it's going to change.
Change the cigarette packet, it still gives you cancer.
Yeah. Should I keep moving on to Ricky and we'll come back? You want to say a few more words to wrap up?
Sorry, I don't know whether we were going to come back and bounce back again, but I thought maybe just to say that you know, I guess what can we do differently or to get that legitimate or positive change. And I think the great thing about the Senate inquiry up in Darwin, I'm pretty sure that's the first time you've seen 3 female First Nations senators in a closed session with Aboriginal community members, just giving them, just opening up the floor to be able to speak their minds, their positions, and their concerns, and have that you know, laid out on Hansard as well. So I think, you know, there are, for all the things that aren't changing, there are, I guess, some opportunities there to try and activate it. I think I'll just go from the last line from my article. Where is it? It's too long. I guess the fact that there was a wholly female First Nations panel of senators, WA Green Senator and Yamaji Noongar woman Dorinda Cox, Lydia Thorpe, proud Jabwarang Ganai Gandijamara woman, an Australian Green Senator from Victoria, and Malindir McCarthy, who is directly related to the Yanyuwa, Garawa and Mara nations being heard, gives hope to some that justice and equality can be attained when First Nations people ourselves have an opportunity to control the systems that typically disenfranchise, disempower and marginalise us. So yeah, hopefully there's hope.
Yeah.
And don't frack the NT.
Absolutely. It's all about changing who holds the center of power. It's about taking that power back. And while that power is not in First Nations hands, while it is held by the major parties, there is no certainty other than the fact that the status quo will remain, will keep doing what the colonial system has been doing from the get-go. So this is really a struggle for power that we're talking about. And I think, as Arnie Elaine said, we need to keep calling it out and speaking truth to power. All right, I will move on to Ricky Dank, who's known by a traditional name as Ladi Noralima. She's a traditional owner from Gurindji and Wakaya nations, and she's with her husband, Dr. Sanjit Paul. Ricky Dank was one of just 4 Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander delegates at the COP26 climate summit held recently in Glasgow. She and her family have been actively trying to protect her country from exploitation and destruction from mining and industry for more than 3 decades. She has written a brilliant submission to the Senate inquiry regarding the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Amendment Economic Empowerment Bill 2021, which I hope, Ricky, you'll speak a little bit to, because I know there's been lots of interpretations and misinterpretations of that law. She's concerned regarding ongoing attempts by government and industry to further diminish the rights of First Nations people. And Dr. Sanjit Paul is a father and husband of a traditional owner. He's a medical doctor with 20 years experience and currently working in managing in-flight medical emergencies for a major international airline. He also has a history of human rights advocacy and has been actively involved in the family's fight to protect country. Thank you so much for being here. I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you very much for having us. First of all, we'd like to thank and acknowledge all of our elders that are on here tonight that are, sharing their stories. It is a privilege to hear from you. We appreciate you. And we appreciate that you are still fighting. We are sorry that you have to continue to fight, but we want you to know that the younger generation are stepping up, and we would love for you to at some point in time feel like you have the chance to step back and enjoy the rest of your lives, because you have given us so much. So thank you, and we appreciate you. So yes, my country is probably about an hour out of Borroloola. It's Marubana country, so it's women's country. And at the moment, our country is being fracked by Empire. So we haven't been fighting for very long, not as long as Gadrian or the Karawara or the Yanglo people. We've probably been fighting for about 2 years against Empire, but we have been fighting for the rights of our country for, as you said, for a long time. Sorry, so so for us, with all the recent Senate inquiries and things like that, it's I feel in a way grateful that it's brought all this to a head, that we can finally get this out, because half the battle for us was being able to get media attention, get people to listen and to hear our story with our concerns of destruction of land. But unfortunately, it's kind of for us come a little bit too late, because the fracking now has already started. They're ready to go. And it also came too with the mine and it becoming open cut. We'd had people for years fight for the rights to be heard, and for people to listen to us. And I felt like we've always taken a back seat to other things, so for us, it's been difficult to get our story out there, our voice out there. It took for me to go to COP to harass Leonardo DiCaprio to get international awareness. And you know, Aboriginal people shouldn't have to do that. Everybody knows that, everyone knows what goes on in Australia in terms of, you know, the intervention and Aboriginal rights and the loss of rights of Aboriginal people. So everybody is well and truly aware of these things that are happening. It's just, unfortunately, they want, I think it's not that they want, I think it's difficult to deal with. It's in your face and it's brutal. And I think people don't want to face up to those things, that brutal past and the brutal things that are continuing to happen today. I'll let you jump in.
So thank you for having me. So obviously I'm not Indigenous, and I mean since I've been a member of Ricky's family for the last 15 years. I mean, her family's become my family, and her mimis are my mimis. It's only since then that I've been acutely aware of all of these issues. I, like most Australians, only know what's on the news and what's on the TV and about surrounding these issues. And it's only when you become intricately involved that you become aware of the scope of the impact of everything and the struggles. Because I mean, the frustrations that I feel over the last 15 years of talking to people, talking to politicians, writing to politicians, being in front of Senate inquiries, and thinking that, you know, you're making an articulate submission, thoughtful submission, a powerful submission, and then just nothing changes, you know. And so to put that into context of, you know, that's how I feel, as, you know, although my family is involved, I don't have history or context, but imagine, you know, all the First Nations people of this country, how they must feel to not be given a voice most of the time, and when they use their voice, not to be heard. And so that, you know, that leads to a position of despair and, you know, loss of hope for most people, and I can understand that. And, you know, pacifism hasn't helped. Activism doesn't seem to have helped either. And, you know, I'm not one to advocate for civil unrest, but you can understand when in First Nations people want, you know, reach that point of knowing nothing else. And yeah, I hope we don't come to that point. But we are reaching, I mean, more and more countries being lost, more and more countries being destroyed. And when you have no home, no hope, and no future, it's a recipe for things to deteriorate even further. And when we're talking about the intervention, I mean, the intervention, like Professor Thalia was saying, ending the intervention is just words. It needs to be more than that, it needs to be actions. I mean, because the intervention literally started 250 years ago, and we've just had successive waves of interventions. And the most recent intervention is just a more focused one aimed at the Northern Territory population.
And I feel like we're the test dummies for these things. I feel like, they target territory, you know, in Aboriginal people in the territory, and they're like, okay, let's see how this goes, and then we're going to roll it out to the rest of the Indigenous population around Australia. But I think they get caught up with, okay, well, how are we going to name this, and how are we going to get away with being able to do this to everybody else?
Yeah, I mean, even as Professor Thalia was saying, the amount of mining leases that became available after the intervention was enacted is symbolic of a secondary gain to be achieved from the policy. And I mean, when you look at fracking, I think 80% or 90% of the territory is under at least exploration leases for gas. And when you want to talk about privilege, I mean, off the Great Australian Bight, the gas projects, the gas drilling for gas in the Great Australian Bight was stopped, which was the right thing to do for environmental reasons.
And also in Manly as
and
well.
off the coast of Sydney and the eastern coast of, you know, New South Wales, they stopped the offshore gas drilling there. But in the Northern Territory, where it's, you know, 80%, 90% Indigenous population who have no intrinsic political rights, there's nothing happening. I mean, it's a free for all. So then you get a true sense of political power. And although, to be fair, I mean, although we live in a democratic society and we all have the right to vote, I mean, our governments don't seem to follow what we want anyway. But for Indigenous people, it's obviously it's a factor of a greater factor of disempowerment.
Disempowerment through all throughout all our life. Whether it is human rights, whether it is land rights, whether it is rights to be able to learn your language in school, whether it is rights to have access to health or education when you're in remote Aboriginal communities. We seem to be always left out. Even as like last year, there were new laws tagged on to the end of native title, which now, allows for companies to, completely skip the part of where they need to consult with traditional owners. And now they can go straight to land councils and get permission, to access Aboriginal land for whether they want to, mine or frack. So in this day and age where we'd expect that, with social media, with people being able to see the injustices that are happening around the world, like, in Palestine, Syria, and now even in Ukraine, that we get to see all that firsthand. It just seems like Australia's still in this dark shadow. There's still this dark shadow in Australia when it comes to Aboriginal rights. And the Australian government seem to be really, really good at shadowing these rights and hiding these rights, even from us. Because you ask anybody in Borroloola, did you know about these changes? And I guarantee you a lot of them, the majority of them would have come back and gone, no. And it's not unless we are on, absolutely following the changes and understanding what's happening and understanding the language that is used, then we have no idea. We are constantly having things done to us, and we are constantly expected to sit there and lie there and let it happen, because if we even flinch, we are accused of being combative, and we are accused of being violent people. So for us, particularly for us Gorenji, Rombaria people, for women's country, Marabana country, we see that, they are still using violence against us. They are still being violent. And if we even say anything back, then they're gaslighting us. We're the violent ones, because how dare we speak?
So I know we might have used up our time,
yeah.
But can I just ask, Ricky, you should just say about when the intervention started, the impact?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'll just show you quickly. I don't know if you'll be able to see that, that picture. So this is my grandfather here, my mimis, my grannies, and I speak on behalf of them. My grandfather and one of my mimis has passed. Yeah, sorry, I apologize. But my granny, my Mimi, she called when the intervention was just starting to happen. She called my mother. She was in tears and she was hysterical. And I'm sorry to the elders to tell you to talk about this, because I know this is the same story. But she said, Deborah, get the kids out. They're coming for our children again. Get the kids out. We need to get them out. They're coming for them again. So to have my grandmothers to have to relive this again, it is devastating, because our old people they've done enough and they deserve to rest. And to just be constantly harassed by the government, it makes me angry. So the intervention has just absolutely done a whole lot of damage that cannot be undone. To have a sign outside our outstation saying that, we ban pornography, drinking, and everything. There's no, that in this area it is banned. It's like telling everyone driving past on the Carpentaria Highway that, look here, there's a whole lot of drunkards, there's a whole lot of people who rape their children here that live here. You know, and my family are very proud people. We're hardworking people. We've always worked. For whatever we've gotten, we've worked hard for it. But to have someone come and name us as drunk, lazy, and people who rape their children is devastating. And to have that, my grandmother, go through that again is devastating.
I think that's us for now.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sandra and Ricky. I just wanted to have a moment because I feel that you recounting that experience of your Mimi was very close to your heart, the hearts of many people. And I think for all of us who have seen the damage, before the intervention, child protection was a very small department. Territory families has become this enormous bureaucracy and continues to grow, whether it's taking children from their parents into out-of-home care, often non-Aboriginal people, or residential facilities, or whether it's taking Aboriginal children and putting them in Dondale or Alice Springs detention centres. There's been a devastating impact on children, and yet the intervention, the claims, the rhetoric, the lies of the Howard government and governments following was that it was meant to protect the children. It is absolutely devastated the lives of many children and families, and that continues. Like I think Kumanjai said earlier, maybe it's more subtle now, maybe it's hidden in a bureaucratic veil behind it, but the reality is the same children are being stolen. I also just wanted to pick up on what Ricky and Dr. Sanjit said about the denial of political rights. Another major impact of the intervention was to take away the power of community councils, of Aboriginal-run community councils. They were centres of political power for Aboriginal people in community, along with the rights they had over their land, and along with the ability to teach language in school. Bilingual education, which Ricky talked about diminishing since the intervention, has been all but decimated in the last 15 years. And the impact is that not only are children not learning in language, the whole education system and learning process is poorer because of it. And it's another aspect of culture that is the governments are attempting to rip apart. And I think all these things we're talking about are connected, whether it's relationships to family, whether it's land, whether it's language and Aboriginal laws, they're all connected. And the intervention has targeted all of them collectively. And I'm really sorry to hear, Ricky, what your grandmother and other grandmothers had to endure, but also completely heartened to see that you're living that legacy of fighting, and even as Dr. Sanjit said, on the not ruling out anything. If civil disobedience is where it comes to, then these are the tactics we all have to think about, because we need to be louder, we need to be stronger to fight against the intervention and everything in its path. Thank you again. I will now introduce Dr. Greg Marks, who again I have been in the company of for many years, having these discussions about the intervention. And I know I first saw him speak in 2007, and he spoke with such fire in his belly that has not in any way mitigated since. And I think with everything that's ensued, he has only come back more fierce in his criticisms. So to give you a bit of background, Greg Marks is a writer, researcher and advocate with a long experience with Aboriginal issues and programs in the Northern Territory. He retains links with the Territory and is particularly concerned about the situation of outstations and homeland communities. So Greg, I'll hand it over to you to please explain a little bit more about what's happened with government policy, the expansion of private lands, and the enduring claims to land rights.
Yeah, I was muted, I think, so I'll start there again. So thanks, Talia, and good evening, everybody. I'd first of all like to acknowledge with respect the Aboriginal owners and custodians of this land where I am, which is known these days as the Australian Capital Territory. And also, before I begin, I'd just like to say that it's a bizarre situation. I'm going to be talking mainly about housing as one aspect of the intervention. But it's a bizarre situation when it's so obvious how terrible the housing situation is. It's not like it's not unknown, it's very obvious to everybody, and yet the Commonwealth resolutely refuses to put a single dollar towards it. And on its own, it's just a bizarre fact. So what I want to try and do is to unpack some of that and find out how that's come about or how we've got to here. It's a bit like Ricky said, governments are so good at hiding their words, and yet you have to sort of try and weasel out these words to find out what's really going on. So that's going to be my attempt tonight to try and do that a bit. I've called the paper Racism and the Intervention, which everybody is acknowledging. And look, I've spoken and written, so now I'll start the paper. I've spoken and written previously about the dire housing situation for Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, as have many others. The latest was a very good report on the ABC News called Out of Sight. It's on 19th of March. I think probably most of you have seen that. But I need to go right back. I need to go right back to 2007, 15 years ago. This is because many people, they just don't have that long enough time span to quite catch what's going on here. So if we go back to 2007, back to September 2007, there was a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, signed between the Commonwealth and the Northern Territory government. That memorandum was called the Memorandum of Understanding between the Australian government and the Northern Territory government on Indigenous housing, accommodation and related services. So I just call it the Housing MOU. Now, just 1 month before that, 1 month earlier in August 2007, we had the intervention with the Northern Territory Emergency Response Act, the NTER. Now, everybody knows about the NTER, about the intervention, but who knows about the Housing MOU? And yet I think that this MOU is as important as the NTER legislation, now called Stronger Futures. My argument is that the Aboriginal housing disgrace is part and parcel of the intervention. So these two things are locked together, although they're often seen as separate matters. The Housing MOU was just 1 month after the intervention and got rolled under the intervention umbrella. Or in government doublespeak of the time, this is a quote from some government paper, the 2007 MOU was pursued in parallel with activity under the Australian government's Northern Territory Emergency Response. That's the intervention. But the Housing MOU, it swapped responsibilities. Basically, out of the blue, the Commonwealth had funded outstations and homelands before. Now, in 2007, the outstation homelands were simply dumped on an underprepared and under-resourced Territory government. Claire Martin was the Chief Minister. She was blindsided by John Howard. Absolutely no Aboriginal communities or organisations were consulted at all with this MOU. There was no informed consent, even though the lives of Aboriginal Territorians were about to be turned upside down. But the housing MOU has always been out of the public view. It is kept, it's a hidden part of the intervention. Indeed, the government went to considerable lengths to keep the MOU secret. I can tell you a number of stories about that escapade and how they couldn't keep it secret in the end. So this is one of the reasons, I think, that people don't see the link between housing and the intervention. The MOU got subsumed into the National Partnership on Remote Indigenous Housing. So you won't find the MOU now, but it remains part and parcel of the arrangements put in place for the intervention. It's a ghost in the machinery of Aboriginal housing poverty. If we want to get rid of the intervention, we have to get rid of this MOU ghost, and that is the ban on outstation and homelands housing as well. So what did this MOU do? It banned any Commonwealth support for housing in homelands and outstation communities. 500 plus communities and thousands of Aboriginal residents in perpetuity without a time frame, forever and a day. The MOU is the reason for the housing mess. Part of this process was disbanding the old CHIP programs. Some of you will remember the CHIP program, the Community Housing and Infrastructure Program. That was run by ATSIC in conjunction with the states and the territories. That was a good program. It built houses on all communities. The MOU, though, represented hard-edged policy, very deliberate policy. Hundreds of communities and thousands of residents were cut adrift. There was nothing accidental or benign about this, and it's exactly why we have the current housing crisis. This was done by the Howard government. The sad thing is, it was continued by Labor when Jenny Macklin was minister, and now by the coalition with Ken Wyatt as minister. The Northern Territory government, though, has commissioned an independent review of the Homelands policy in 2019. The report of that review was released early last year, and the first and the major recommendation of that review is this one, that there be a re-engagement with the Australian government and land councils to develop a sustainable policy. So here was the opportunity with that review to bring the Commonwealth back into the homeland story and potentially unravel the legacy of that 2007 MOU. I mean, it's ridiculous to think the NT government can solve the housing problem on Aboriginal homelands and communities on its own. The NT government wants the Commonwealth back in. The Aboriginal communities want the Commonwealth back in. But when the NT Remote Housing Minister, Chancey Page, late last year said he had asked for a meeting with the Federal Minister, Wyatt, to discuss the, quote, dire need for housing on homelands, a spokesman for Mr. Wyatt, Mr. Peach, was told the Commonwealth's current housing investment across the Northern Territory would remain unchanged. That is, no Commonwealth money for housing on homelands and outstations. So this is where we find ourselves, at a dead end or a roadblock. It hasn't happened yet. Yet any Commonwealth funding would have to contribute to new homes, not only existing ones. Oh, sorry, that comes later. But we have got this roadblock. So tonight, I want to draw some connections. So I've called the paper Racism and the Intervention. I see a few main components. Firstly, as the flyer for tonight's forum tells us, in 2010, the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association stated, quote, "It is predicted that the intervention, will leave a negative legacy on the psychological and social well-being, on the spirituality and cultural integrity of the prescribed communities." Now, prescribed communities are the 72 communities targeted under the intervention legislation. They're the major and some medium-sized Aboriginal communities in the NT that were virtually taken over by the Commonwealth government under the intervention. However, the intervention NTR, in fact, applies to over 500 communities, with over 70% of Aboriginal people within the Northern Territory. So approximately 45,500 Aboriginal people are affected by the intervention. So what the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association says is so true, but we've got to get one thing clear. It's not just about the 72 communities, it's about all the Aboriginal communities, about all the separate Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. All Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory are caught up in the intervention, and housing shows this as much as anything. So by excluding homeland and outstations from housing money, the Commonwealth is directly intervening in every community. For example, if there's less housing on homelands, there's more pressure and overcrowding on the 72 so-called prescribed communities. So in a recent interview on the ABC, the Northern Territory Minister, Chancey Page, has called this out by making it clear that the other several hundred communities are being left high and dry. I don't think Mr. Page has given in. I don't know him, but he seems to be persisting. He recently said, quote, "I will continue to advocate for Commonwealth funding for homelands. A Commonwealth homelands funding package would ensure homeland residents, like those in Garva, it's an outstation on Elko, I think, have access to the funding and support they need to maintain their homes and assets," end of quote. So the intervention and its housing policy has to end. If the Commonwealth ministers say, we are funding housing on 72 prescribed communities or whatever, we say no. We're talking about all Aboriginal communities of the Northern Territory. No more divide and conquer. Now, secondly, I want to get to the psychological and moral effects that the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association has talked about. And this is all about racism, as we've been hearing. Tonight's forum is called in the context of the UN International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So racism, at one level, we all know what that means. Aboriginal people live with it all their lives. We know that every racist comment hurts, destabilizes. There's a deep psychological element to racism, even where it is not dangerous to life and limb. There's a deep personal, demoralizing aspect to racism. Then the link between racism and discrimination is direct. Discrimination based on race is outlawed by the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and in Australia by the Racial Discrimination Act. It is illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. But there's also a desire to avoid the charge of racism. Somebody else alluded to this earlier. It's an awkward topic. Many Australians don't like to see themselves as racist. Even the victims often don't want to make too much of a fuss or be seen as overly sensitive. But now racism and housing, it's racial discrimination that lies at the heart of the Aboriginal housing scandal. This failure is usually described as a policy failure. And we identify the overcrowding, the health implications, the social problems of so many people being crowded together, the fact that people have to live in towns and large communities when they would rather be on their homelands, etc. So it's portrayed as a social justice matter. But fundamentally, it is an act of racial discrimination. And if it is, and we can identify that, it brings housing policy closer to being an illegal act rather than just a wrong policy. An illegal policy is much worse than a wrong-headed policy and much harder to defend. So we have to hold the intervention and housing policy together, not let them get separated, and to level the charge of racism against both of them, because it is racism that lies at the heart of that MOU and the intervention and stronger futures. These things have happened because some of the architects of these policies do not like Aborigines. They do not like Aboriginal culture and traditional laws and authority systems. They want to strip these things away and, inverted commas, modernise Aboriginal society in their own image. Others think they know what is best for Aborigines, better than Aboriginal people themselves. We used to call this assimilation policy. But to deal with this, the housing racial discrimination argument itself gets a bit tricky. For one thing, housing seems a separate argument, although it was quickly rolled into the intervention. But governments never admit that. They've kept it sort of separate. And then within the housing for Aboriginal communities, there's a terrible distinction between major communities and homelands and outstations. In this lottery, if you're in the wrong sort of community, you never ever get housing under current policy settings. So there is a weird discrimination going on by governments between blackfellas. Good blackfellas might get a house or a refurb. Bad blackfellas get a few pennies for maintenance and repairs, usually with a whole set of conditions. So how do you argue against this? If you do, it looks like you're picking sides. You know, it's classic divide and conquer. So the whole housing policy has to be set against the right under international law for Aboriginal people to be able and supported to live on their traditional lands and territories. The argument has to be that by interfering in where Aboriginal people live, by deciding where they should live, governments are committing an act of racial discrimination. They're not only following a poor policy, they're acting in a racially discriminatory way. In a way, it's saying you are denying us the right of self-determination. It really is appalling arrogance on the part of governments and wrong by international law standards. So what I'm trying to say is that discrimination against outstations and homelands is discrimination against all Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. They are being denied freedom of choice about living on their traditional country. Now, a couple of other issues quickly before I conclude. One thing I just want to note is that the Commonwealth is trying to get out of its responsibilities for Indigenous issues. It's trying to get back to the pre-1967 referendum. So that's Australia, where the states and territories only had the responsibility for Aboriginal policies and programs. This way, I suspect the Commonwealth also hopes to avoid international scrutiny. So we have to keep reminding the Commonwealth that they are part of this. Since 1967, they have responsibilities. And the second issue, again, I want to just identify, is this red herring, and Sabine mentioned it, that outstations and homelands are on private land. Therefore, there is no responsibility on governments to provide housing. Now, I've heard this from both sides of politics. I've heard this from Labor and I've heard this from Liberals. And this is an absolute nonsense argument. But I've heard it often used as an excuse for not doing anything about outstation and homelands housing. So I just repeat, this is a nonsense argument. We go into the reasons why, but I don't need to. It's just absolute rubbish. So the nature of Aboriginal title does not absolve governments from normal community responsibilities, including social or community housing. They can't get out of it under that supposed legal subterfuge. So to come to a conclusion, so I'm saying that when Stronger Future goes, so must the ghost of the 2007 Memorandum on Housing. Housing is a human right, not only a social justice or health issue, as important as these are. This is going to take a lot of educating of politicians, also journalists, academics, etc. I'm worried that the ALP is not yet in the right place should they come to government. They need to be convinced. There was an ABC report that Linda Burney is considering the housing situation on homelands. She's quoted as saying, quote, Labor is very interested in looking at the issue of housing and the conditions of housing on homelands. Well, it's got to go a lot further than that, I think. Overcrowding, health, and the point on that, of course, is, as we've been seeing, the election is coming up. The ALP is worried about losing the 2 Northern Territory seats. I think particularly Lingiari, but I think they're worried about both of them. This probably is as good a time as any for pressure about outstation, homelands and Aboriginal housing. While they're worried is probably the time they might actually listen. Now, overcrowding, health, social justice, all very important. The fundamental issue is that housing for Aboriginal people on their traditional land and territories is a right, and to flagrantly deny that right is an act of racial discrimination. That does not mean that governments have to instantly provide housing for all who want it. It does mean that a policy of a blanket ban on housing on outstations and homelands is a flagrant breach of the Commonwealth's obligations. It does mean that the Commonwealth Government, in partnership with the Northern Territory Government, is obligated to move rapidly, take practical, concrete, positive steps, particularly including housing, towards the progressive realisation and achievement of the right to live on one's traditional country. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate you bringing that all together for us. And I think one of the biggest indictments of this system is that despite the very rich connections that Aboriginal people have to homelands in the Northern Territory, it is in fact the Northern Territory that has the highest homeless population in the country. So to have a system that allows Aboriginal people to live on the periphery of society on a country in which they own is, I think, an absolute travesty on the position of all governments, of all persuasions. And like you said, whether it's with relation to housing or other policies, it's really self-determination that is necessary here. I'm going to now introduce our final set of speakers. We have Bruno Japarula Wilson from Yuendamu and Frank Barter. Bruno is a Warlpiri man who grew up in Yuendamu. He is heavily involved in education at the bilingual Yuendamu school as teacher and president of the school council, and in the bush with men's business. Frank Barter is a long-term Kadia resident of Yuendamu, and he recently self-published My Yuendamu Story, which you can purchase online. He has been well received by both Yapa and Kadia people. Both Bruno and Frank have witnessed the damage wrought by the intervention and the Stronger Futures legislation on the social fabric of Yuendamu, and I look forward to hearing more about the experience of that very strong community that I've had the privilege to visit on a number of occasions, and have sat in courts and seen how the white court system adjudicates Aboriginal people, and been absolutely outraged by the fact that you have white people in that, you know, very, very rich culturally and rich in their traditions, Warlpiri people who are talked down to by white fellas. And, you know, I applaud the ongoing work of Warlpiri people there and supporters like Frank. So I'll turn it over to both of you now.
But I want to go back and talk about the intervention that started back in 2007. I just turned 18 back in 2007. That's when I was still young about the intervention. That I didn't expect to see a military soldier like come in the move. That actually took me a long time, about 3 or 5 years, to realize what's really going on, what really happened. So now I see the intervention that's damaged the Warlpiri, the Yapa people in Central Australia, or throughout Northern Territory. But from my experiences seeing family members as well in Indigo, when sorry, there's a dog. There's this package of measures that have been enforced by the legislation back then, affected Warlpiri mob in the territory. One of the measures that meant to help Aboriginal people financially was this new basics card that they brought in. We call it as a racist card here in Yuendamu. It's pretty obvious. That created more disaster in Yuendamu, which it made the Warlpiri mob really connected first together as one people. Then when the payment system came in, the basics card, that made our well-being more less generous to share with each other. Like what I heard Greg said earlier on, the divide, I've seen something like that happening as well with Ammo, with Yapa to Yapa as well. Just what happened with the intervention and the aftermath where we face is, it's still pretty huge. Of course, the young fella got shot here back in 2019. Well, it's also obvious again, a point finger at the intervention that created the police to able to come from Alice Springs dressed up like if they're going to Afghanistan or Iraq, coming to Indomo. Before that, we used to have permit systems. Permit systems was designed to stop anybody coming in, basically. When that was taken away, everything can come into this community. The Indomo community is really, it's tired now. We are tired of listening to governments, both Labor and Liberal. Family of Komunja Woka is tired. They're really tired, depressed. You out there must understand, deeply understand that if you put on our shoes, living out in Indonesia, you will see what's really going on. It's how the police responded, how the other government organizations here didn't have enough. But it's basically everything was intervention that destroyed our lifestyle, livelihood in Indonesia. The top one was getting rid of a tribal council. That after that, like a domino, everything fell apart. Since 2015, been at the school, Indonesia school, studying at the RAID program as well to be a teacher. But even the kids I see in the school still have the aftermath results of the intervention. It was before, it was different and peaceful before the intervention. Indomo turned to be this pretty aberrant, racist place. That then it's a lot to talk about, but just trying to get a little bit of pieces. The main ones we want to talk about. It's the tribal council that have been taken away, the basics card that destroyed Wadbury kinship culture, made it, yeah, and just turning into school sort of provided me now to teach the younger ones and the school-age kids that it's time to teach them the truth, what's going on. Because in Indonesia we have this school which is bilingual, and in about 3 years time, 2 or 3 years, it'll be a 50th anniversary of the Indonesia school bilingual. So we'd love this school to stay bilingual. Teaching one way is as important as is teaching English. It's just Started feeling a bit nervous. And I'm still a bit new to fighting this intervention, but I've seen it, what it's like from 18-year-old, 15 years later. It's brought into more all other, the surrounding communities just really low, and it's not a livelihood, not livable. We go back to the housing situation. Lindermoor is really rubbish with housings. It's just really low. It's look like a third world country within a first world country. I see that. That's all. Yeah, that's all.
All right, my turn. Can you hear me okay? Hello? Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I've got a few. All right. Well, in a former life, I used to be a geologist, so I know a few things about fracking. Now, with fracking, what you basically got is you got a gas-saturated shale or a gas-saturated coal measure, and it's peacefully lying there under the ground. So then you have an intervention and you frack the shit out of it, you break it all up, and all of a sudden this gas flows out, and once it's gone, it's gone. And a few people make a few $1 billion out of it and then bugger off somewhere else. But the intervention is also like fracking, but instead of fracturing shale or coal measures, it's fracturing the social fabric of the place, right? And so a good example is what Bruno talked about, the basic card, which initially was called income management. Well, they didn't manage very much at all. All they did is take control of people's money. One of the side effects of this was that all of a sudden there was less money on the community, less cash. And now they've even got a thing to replace it, because basic card, I assume on the 26th of June or whatever it was, will suddenly cease to exist. And so instead of just sort of saying, oh, you little beauty, it's going to run out, they've now got the cashless card that some people make a shitload of money out of. Anyway, it's even worse. Cashless card, cashless community. Now, the thing is that Walbury people, generally speaking, they've got these family groups and they're very generous, right? And so it was quite common to see a child, you know, catch up with an artist, and this artist had a bunch of money they got, and they would give this child a $20 note. The little child would go to a shop, buy a few lollies or whatever, give his change to his mates or his family, and then the other child would go in, and that's how things were. And there was always this generosity going about. The Mel Bruff and Jenny Macklin, the pioneers of this bloody stuff, they kept talking about humbug. And it just showed you that they had no idea of how these communities function. They would see anybody giving money to somebody else as having had it extorted or something. The fact that a lot of these older people were glad to give their little nephews or whatever grandchildren some money as part of this generosity, this communal thing, yet the government saw this as, and they had a few examples, some old pensioner lady who was threatened that her washing machine would be smashed. I think Mel Bruff came out with that little beauty. And the thing is that these are the sort of side effects. Okay, now, as a result of that, of this less cash in the community, then all supposedly to stop people from buying smokes and and pornography. Now, it was virtually unknown in Yunnaboo, and a lot of people said, "What's this pornography?" You know. Anyway, and the big signs, yeah. Now they didn't put it in front of churches and Boy Scout halls, did they? But anyway, that's just by the way. So yeah, this whole colonization, this trying to force people not recognizing the strengths of Walbury culture, assuming that somehow it's inferior, has to be intervened with and it has to be changed. And it's a complete nonsense. And Talia mentioned about going into the court and seeing this farce of some Walbury people being dragged there because they didn't renew their license or something, or didn't turn up in court. And there's these pompous foreigners talking to them, you know, in legal jargon, which you'd be hard pressed to understand even if you were a fluent English speaker. You know, they talk this stuff. It's a little bit like listening to a bunch of geologists talk about rocks. But anyway, this is something that is not obvious. People look at housing density, they look at roads, they look at all that sort of stuff. They can measure that. But what you can't measure is the damage to a social fabric, which is done by imposing a draconian system. And it's all about control. It's got very little to do with what's the best thing. So, yeah, you know, so here I'm raving on, but I've got to correct one thing. That book of mine is not available online. You can get it through Red Kangaroo Bookshop. I think they got a few copies left. And I recently, much to my surprise, I've sold my last copy out of the 600 that I had printed. But anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll write a second one, and I'll see what happens after after this thing finishes. But yeah, this whole business, this intervention thing, it's just sort of, it's sneaky, it's nasty, it's terrible, and it has all these side effects. And when it comes to the children in Yunnaboo, we're having a sort of an epidemic in break-ins. You know, these are the kids that used to get $20 from their grandfather. They don't get $20 from their grandfather anymore, so now they break in. And there's a group of grandmothers in Alice Springs, and they are very astute. They have labelled these the children of the intervention. And I can just see what's going to happen. The next government are just going to carry on with it under a different name, maybe not even change the legislation, but the basic racism and the assimilationist imperative and all that sort of thing, that needs a change much bigger than what these peanuts in Canberra can do. And I think I've said enough. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Frank. It's good to hear the cheeky dogs in the background. And I just like to honour that Annie Elaine is one of the grandmothers doing that work, you know, and always reminding us of the impacts of the children on the children.